Supreme Court Associate Justice Antonio Co Jr. suggests a complete leadership overhaul over at PhilHealth and for the National Treasury to return the 60 billion pesos in excess funds, quote-unquote, that has already been transmitted to the state insurer or by the state insurer. During the third oral arguments on petitions against the fund transfer, Justice Co insisted that PhilHealth should have at least used this budget to broaden benefit packages for members. Department of Health spokesperson, Assistant Secretary Albert Domingo said PhilHealth has always been instructed to do so, and yet 3 presidents and over 10 leaders since its inception in 2013, nothing has happened. The Bureau of Treasury replied that the funds were not spent because PhilHealth lacked personnel, hospitals, and equipment to implement programs, and that is why there are funds that have not been used. To this, Co asserted that it is incumbent upon the insurer's leadership to give the people their taxes worth.
Probably it's time to overhaul PhilHealth and change the board for not complying what the law requires. As long as the government recognizes now, it is now incumbent on the part of government to return the 60 billion that was transmitted already.
Hindi po natin tututulan, hindi po natin lalabanan kung ano po ang inuutos ng Supreme Court.
Now let's discuss further with Professor Cielo Magno, former Undersecretary of the Department of Finance and one of the petitioners against PhilHealth's excess fund transfer to the National Treasury. Good evening po sa inyo.
Good evening, Ses, Sean, and Pauline. Maraming salamat po sa pag-imbita sa akin dito sa One News.
You must be elated at, the statements or during your oral arguments, what Justice Co had said about how PhilHealth should be run and also about, actually being on your side, more or less.
Yes, but says the discussion has been very clear because the law on Universal Healthcare Act is also very clear in terms of how the money of PhilHealth should be used. But I think Justice Antonio Co has emphasized a very important point because what the Department of Finance is saying is that they're just encouraging PhilHealth to use its fund. Kailangan daw ng kung may carrot and stick, this is the stick. If you don't use the money, the government will get it and use it for something else. And I think the important point that Justice Co is making is that there must be accountability too, because we might be forgetting that the board of PhilHealth is actually the Department of Finance. The members of the board includes the Department of Finance, the Department of Budget, Department of Health, Department of Labor, and the Department of Social Welfare and Development. And part of the responsibility of board members to make sure that PhilHealth is doing its job. And for me, the way that DOF is speaking, it's like it's not involved in the decision-making process of PhilHealth. So I think by making the point that they are also responsible for running PhilHealth and that they must return the money, I think it establishes the important role of the board on the accountability of PhilHealth.
Okay. Professor Cielo, one thing that really cropped up was the issue of absorptive capacity with regards to PhilHealth, right? Ang sinabi nga ni ASEC Albert Domingo, kahit naman itapon natin lahat ng pera na talagang do them, kahit tama yung math, kung hindi naman nila kayang gastusin dahil sa kakulangan ng tao, ng facilities, etc., wala din naman daw kwenta. This is one thing that you have raised in your previous podcasts over and over again. So I'm sure you're happy to hear that. But I mean, how hard is it to increase an agency's absorptive capacity? Meaning, we understand may red tape then even within the bureaucracy. So, ma-address ba ito ng madalian?
Yeah, that's the question. No? Like, for example, the organizational structure of PhilHealth, isn't that part of the mandate of the board to review the organizational structure of PhilHealth? Who are serving as officers of PhilHealth? Who should they be hiring as officials and leaders of PhilHealth? Hindi naman yan usapin ng kakulangan ng pera dahil sabi nga nila may excess fund. Then they should be hiring people who are fit to run the organization. But you know what is funny? During the first oral argument, when the former president of PhilHealth was being asked, I was aghast. I was in the audience and he cannot even answer questions. And these are people who are we are paying for about, magkano sweldo niyan a month? Mga around 500,000, and he can not even answer basic questions about PhilHealth. And that raises a lot of questions. If you are members of the board, you should demand accountability from the officials of PhilHealth. And ASEC Domingo has been saying this has been the situation for many, many years. And that's the thing, no? It's good that this conversation is now being done so that the public would know how badly PhilHealth is being run. And I think when we demand accountability, it's not just accountability of PhilHealth officials, but also of these government agencies who are supposed to be oversight of this agency.
Well, Professor, we did hear Justice Ko during the oral argument saying it is now incumbent on the government to return the 60 billion pesos to PhilHealth. Are there any legal or financial mechanisms that would actually compel the government to return these funds to PhilHealth?
Well, a final decision by the Supreme Court on our petition would then compel the executive branch of a government to return the 60 billion pesos to PhilHealth.
The palace has said, Professor Cielo, na sabi through palace press officer Yusek Claire Castro na kung utusan kami ng Supreme Court na ibalik yung pera, ibabalik namin. Ang tanong, ganun ba kadali din yun? Na ibalik na lang? What if nagastos na? I mean, do we have a history na nakita nating may inutos yung Supreme Court ibalik, tapos binalik talaga? Kasi ang naaalala ko lang off the top of my head ng mga examples ay inutos na ibalik, tapos hindi naman naibalik. Tapos walang nangyari.
Well, it depends. No, there are previous decisions of the Supreme Court where the court has recognized the mistake in the interpretation of the law. For example, the Internal Revenue Act, when Governor Mandanas submitted a petition to the Supreme Court regarding the problem in terms, or the mistake in terms of computing the Internal Revenue allotment. Okay. The court made the decision that it was indeed a mistake, and therefore you have to recompute. But because of the economic impact of, paying the local governments what the executive owed them, since the local government code in 1991, that would have a significant negative impact. And therefore, the court is saying that we can just apply the new rule moving forward. In this case, I think it's very clear that the direction that the justices are pursuing is the return of the 60 billion money. And if that's the decision, then the executive has to find the money to return the PhilHealth fund.
Yusek, I hope naman they will, if the government is really serious in its health program, it should put somebody capable to run PhilHealth.
I agree. Well, at least they've replaced already the president, and this person who replaced the president has track record in terms of running healthcare facilities. No, but it's not enough to rely on a new president. You have to look at the officials and officers, the directors of PhilHealth. And I think this will be part of the conversation in the Supreme Court, because Justice Kagiwa was also asking about the organizational structure of the actuarial office of PhilHealth. So I think in the succeeding discussions, the justices will look at this further.
Would you say also, in closing, is COA to blame as well in what happened?
Well, the function of COA is really to pinpoint the problems in terms of how PhilHealth is reporting its finances, how it's spending the money, but it's actually not the job of COA to improve the performance of PhilHealth. It's just monitoring it, pointing out the problems in terms of their performance. But it's the responsibility of the board to make sure that PhilHealth complies with the law, fixes their finances so that it becomes more sustainable. So that's why from the very beginning, I'm really surprised with the statement of the Department of Finance saying that, oh, this is PhilHealth's fault. When if we look at it, the Department of Finance, the Department of Health sit in the board of PhilHealth. And the other problem is if, for example, we allow this thinking of what the DOF is saying that, well, if PhilHealth is not using the money, we should allow the Department of Finance to get the money and put it somewhere else. The problem there is, if that is allowed, there will always be an incentive for the board to not expand the expenditure side, so that there will always be excess money for the Department of Finance to get and finance the other portion of the budget. And so that's really very problematic.
But are you saying
so I'm
that
happy.
COA issue ample warnings or reports that would indicate that, these funds are not being used?
Utilized. Yeah.
Yes.
But it happens in every other agency. COA would issue this observation, and it's up for the agency to implement these changes and revise their implementation. So it is a balance of addressing and acknowledging and understanding the COA report, and for the executive and the board to implement the changes that's necessary to address this COA observation.
Ito, I'm not sure, Prof, no, very quickly lang before we say goodbye to you. Naalala ko, I was watching one of your early podcasts about this PhilHealth issue, and you were very firm on pointing out that fourth provision in the GAA that seemed to have been inserted by the House of Representatives, which never existed before. When is that going to be tackled? Because kung wala naman yun, provision na yun, hindi naman sila makakapagwalis ng mga excess, quote-unquote, funds, di ba, from our GOCCs.
Yes, that's actually one of the major arguments of the petition, aside from the Universal Healthcare Act being very clear on how we should spend the PhilHealth money. The other argument is that provision that was inserted in the GAA 2024 is actually unconstitutional because that provision actually tried to amend the existing laws that govern our GOCC. So for example, because it allowed the Department of Finance to get the fund balances of GOCCs, particularly PhilHealth, it amended the Universal Healthcare Act. And I think before we ended the second oral arguments, one of the justices already asked our lawyers on whether this provision amended the existing laws. And we said, our lawyer said yes. And that is the thing, no? Very general law, like the GAA, cannot amend specific laws. And the Supreme Court have previous decisions on that. So I think we have a very strong argument in our petition to ask the Supreme Court to declare that provision of 1D unconstitutional, and therefore that will become a basis also for the Department of Finance and the Treasury to return the money to PhilHealth and for Congress not to repeat it again.
Okay, and the fourth oral arguments have been set for late April, I think after, the Easter break and all of that. What's going to be on the table for the fourth round?
I think there will still be a lot of discussion. I'm very glad the justices are really looking into how PhilHealth is operating. And then that is very helpful, no? The people found champions in the justices by pointing out the inefficiency of PhilHealth and also the responsibility of the different agencies in making sure PhilHealth does its job. And that if we want PhilHealth to function, the role of the DOF is to make the executives do the responsibility of PhilHealth instead of getting the 60 billion pesos. And I think those are the points that the justices are making. So I'm really glad that we are continuing this conversation.